Pol Pot, architect of a Cambodian nightmare. Cambodia, a nation of dense jungles and ancient temples, found itself thrust into one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century under the rule of Pol Pot. Born Saloth Sar in 1925, Pol Pot would go on to orchestrate a genocidal regime that led to the deaths of nearly a quarter of his country's population. This is the story of his life, his rise to power, and the unimaginable suffering he inflicted. Early life and influences. Saloth Sar was born into a moderately prosperous family in Prek Spav, a small village in Cambodia's Kampong Tom province. His family was connected to Cambodian royalty, which afforded him certain privileges, such as access to education. As a young boy, he lived in a Buddhist monastery for several years, a common practice at the time, and later attended a prestigious high school in Phnom Penh. By all accounts, Saloth Sar was an unremarkable student, but his life took a sharp turn when he was awarded a scholarship to study in Paris in 1949. While in France, Pol Pot became immersed in the radical leftist circles of Cambodian students. The French capital, a hub of post-World War II political thought, exposed him to Marxist-Leninist ideology. He joined the French Communist Party and began to form his vision of a classless, agrarian utopia. His time in Paris also marked the beginning of his transformation into a revolutionary thinker, one who believed that Cambodia's traditional society had to be dismantled to build a better future. In 1953, Pol Pot returned to Cambodia. By then the country was in turmoil. The French colonial era was coming to an end, and Cambodia was navigating its newfound independence. It was during this period that Pol Pot became involved with the underground communist movement, laying the groundwork for his rise to power. The road to revolution. By the early 1960s, Pol Pot had risen through the ranks of the Cambodian Communist Party, eventually becoming its leader in 1962. He adopted the pseudonym Pol Pot, a contraction of political potential, as part of his revolutionary persona. Under his leadership, the Communist Party began to consolidate power, and the seeds of the Khmer Rouge were sown. Throughout the 1960s, Cambodia was increasingly drawn into the orbit of the Vietnam War. The United States bombed Cambodian territory to target North Vietnamese forces, displacing millions of rural Cambodians. This chaos provided fertile ground for the Khmer Rouge to recruit followers. Pol Pot capitalized on the anger and desperation of the peasantry, promising to create a fair and equal society. By 1975, after years of guerrilla warfare, the Khmer Rouge seized control of Phnom Penh. The victory marked the end of Cambodia's civil war and the beginning of a nightmare. Year Zero. Pol Pot's vision for Cambodia. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge declared the start of Year Zero, a concept that symbolized a complete break with Cambodia's past. They sought to transform the country into a classless, agrarian society by dismantling all aspects of modern life. What followed was one of the most radical social experiments in history, and one of its deadliest. Cities were evacuated in their entirety. Phnom Penh, once a bustling metropolis, was emptied within days as residents were forced to march into the countryside. The Khmer Rouge abolished money, schools, religion, and private property. Hospitals were shut down, and intellectuals were targeted for elimination. Simply wearing glasses or being able to read could mark someone as an enemy of the revolution. Under Pol Pot's regime, families were torn apart, as loyalty to one's family was seen as a threat to loyalty to the state. People were herded into labor camps, where they worked grueling hours under horrific conditions. Food was scarce, and many were forced to survive on little more than rice gruel. Starvation, disease, and overwork claimed countless lives. One of the most infamous symbols of Pol Pot's regime was Tuol Sleng Prison, also known as S21. Originally a high school, it was converted into a torture and execution center. Of the roughly 20,000 people sent to S21, only a handful survived. Prisoners were tortured until they confessed to crimes they hadn't committed, and then they were executed. The Khmer Rouge kept meticulous records of these atrocities, documenting the horrors they inflicted. By the end of Pol Pot's rule, between 1.7 and 2.5 million Cambodians, roughly 25% of the population, had died. The killing fields, mass graves scattered across the country, became a haunting testament to the regime's brutality. The fall of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot's grip on power began to weaken as his policies devastated the country. His regime was also marked by paranoia and purges, as he suspected even his closest allies of betrayal. Meanwhile, his relationship with Vietnam, once an ally, deteriorated. Border clashes escalated, and in 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. By January 1979, Vietnamese forces captured Phnom Penh, driving the Khmer Rouge into the jungle. Pol Pot fled with his loyalists, and a new Cambodian government, backed by Vietnam, was installed. Despite losing power, Pol Pot continued to lead the remnants of the Khmer Rouge from his jungle hideouts, waging a guerrilla war for nearly 2 decades. Pol Pot's final years. Even after his fall from power, Pol Pot remained a free man for most of his life. Protected by loyal followers, he lived comfortably in remote areas of Cambodia and neighboring Thailand. He gave occasional interviews, unapologetic for the atrocities committed under his rule. He claimed that his actions were necessary to save Cambodia from foreign influence and internal corruption. In 1997, the Khmer Rouge fractured, and Pol Pot was arrested by his own comrades, who placed him under house arrest. The following year, on April 15, 1998, Pol Pot died in his sleep. Officially, the cause of death was a heart attack, but some speculate that he may have committed suicide or been poisoned. He died without ever facing trial for his crimes. Legacy and the quest for justice. The legacy of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge continues to haunt Cambodia. The physical and psychological scars of his regime are still evident in the country's population. Entire generations were wiped out, and survivors carry the trauma of lost loved ones and unimaginable suffering. In the decades following Pol Pot's death, efforts were made to bring Khmer Rouge leaders to justice. The Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, also known as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, was established to prosecute those responsible for the genocide. While some leaders were convicted, many, including Pol Pot, escaped justice. Today, the killing fields and sites like Tul Sling Prison serve as reminders of the horrors of Pol Pot's regime. They stand as warnings of the destructive power of ideology when taken to extremes and the human cost of unchecked tyranny. Pol Pot's life is a grim reminder of how a single individual, driven by ideology and unyielding ambition, can inflict unimaginable suffering. His vision of a utopia became one of history's greatest tragedies, leaving behind a legacy of death, destruction, and lessons that the world must never forget.